One day, without realizing it, you stop measuring your life by what excites you and start measuring it by what feels safe. Not because you're lazy, not because you lack ambition, because life is good enough. The bills get paid, the calendar stays full. People respect what you've built, and that's what makes it dangerous, because obvious unhappiness is easy to notice. But quiet dissatisfaction, that can hide in plain sight for years. Maybe you felt it. Not every day, not even most days, just in certain moments, when you're driving home after work, when you're lying awake at night, when you see someone take a risk you secretly wish you had taken. For a few seconds, a question appears, then disappears. What if there's more? Not more money, not more status, not another promotion, just more. And then the next morning arrives, emails, meetings, deadlines, responsibilities, life continues. And the question quietly returns to wherever you've been keeping it. Nobody tells you the strangest thing about abandoned dreams. They don't disappear, they stay quietly, patiently, waiting. You can ignore them for years, build an entire life around them, convince yourself you've moved on, but every once in a while, they remind you they're still there. A notebook you never finished, a business you never started, a book you never wrote, a place you always wanted to visit, a version of yourself you once imagined becoming. The dream changes shape, but it never completely leaves, because somewhere deep down, you know the difference between a dream you outgrew and a dream you abandoned. And those are not the same thing. Imagine something. You're sitting alone 10 years from now, not old, not broken, not unhappy, just older. The kind of older that arrives much faster than you expected. You look around at the life you've built, and objectively, it's fine, maybe even successful. But then your mind drifts and lands on something you haven't thought about in a while. That thing, the thing you kept postponing, the thing you always planned to get back to, the thing that never felt urgent until time made it urgent. And for a moment, you realize something unsettling. You weren't waiting for the right time. You were waiting for certainty, and certainty never came. Most people think failure is what destroys dreams. But failure is loud. Failure gets your attention. Failure forces a decision. The real danger is something much quieter. Postponement. Because postponement feels responsible, reasonable, temporary. You tell yourself you'll do it later. After this project, after this promotion, after the kids are older, after life settles down. But life doesn't settle down. Life just changes shape. And each delay becomes slightly easier than the last. Until one day, you're no longer choosing to wait. Waiting has simply become who you are. And that's where this story begins. Not in a desert, not near a pyramid, not with treasure. It begins with a question so common that millions of people feel it, and almost nobody answers it. What happens to a person when they ignore the thing they know they should pursue? Not for a week, not for a year, for a lifetime. What does that do to them? What does it slowly turn them into? Because there is a character in this story who answers that question. A character most readers overlook. A character who never becomes a villain, never commits a crime, never ruins anyone's life. And yet, he might be the most tragic person in the entire book, not because he failed, but because he waited. We'll come back to him. Before we meet him, we need to meet a boy, a shepherd, a recurring dream, and a decision that most people spend their entire lives trying to avoid. Because long before there was treasure, there was a choice. Stay where it's safe, or follow something you don't fully understand. And that choice is where every meaningful transformation begins. Long before there was treasure, there was a dream. Not the kind people write down during New Year's resolutions. Not a goal, not a plan, a dream. The kind that keeps returning when you've already decided to ignore it. There was a young shepherd living in the hills of southern Spain. His life wasn't miserable. That's important, because most people imagine transformation begins when life falls apart. It usually doesn't. More often, it begins when life is good enough. The shepherd had freedom. He traveled, read books, slept beneath the stars. Every day looked different from the last. And yet, something kept pulling at him, a recurring dream. Every time he slept beneath the ruins of an old church, the same dream returned. A child would take him by the hand, lead him toward the Egyptian pyramids, and tell him a treasure was waiting there. Then, just before he learned where the treasure was hidden, he would wake up. Most people dismiss dreams like that. But the dream itself isn't the interesting part. The interesting part is that it kept returning, because that's how certain desires behave. Maybe it was music. Maybe it was writing. Maybe it was starting something of your own. Maybe it was a place you once promised yourself you'd eventually visit. You don't think about it every day anymore. Years may pass. Entire chapters of life may pass. But when it returns, it still feels strangely alive, as if time touched everything except that. And eventually the shepherd reaches a point many people recognize. He can keep ignoring the question, or he can find out where it leads. That decision brings him to an old man, a stranger sitting in a town square, a man who introduces himself as a king. And during their conversation, the old man says something that quietly becomes the foundation of the entire story. He calls it a personal legend. Most summaries translate this into, follow your dreams, but that's too shallow. A dream can be temporary. A personal legend is something else. It's the thing that keeps calling long after convenience would have buried it. The thing that survives distance, time, distraction. The thing that refuses to completely leave. And then the old man says something even more uncomfortable. Children usually know exactly what they want. Adults usually don't, not because the desire disappeared, because other voices arrived first. Expectations, responsibilities, fear, practicality. Little by little, those voices become louder than the original one. And then the old man points toward a baker. Just another man working in town. Most people would never notice him, but the old man does. Years earlier, that baker wanted to travel. He wanted to see the world. The same way the shepherd does now. But somewhere along the way, he chose the safer path, the respectable path, the understandable path. First, he would build stability. Then he would pursue the dream. At least that's what he told himself, and maybe that's true. Or maybe the dream slowly became something he talked about instead of something he pursued. The shepherd listens, not realizing he's being shown two futures, one possibility standing beside him, the other looking back from the mirror. Most people think clarity comes first, then action. But standing in that town square, the shepherd still has no proof, no map, no guarantee, no evidence that treasure actually exists. The only thing he knows is that staying will leave him wondering, and sometimes that's enough. Not certainty, not confidence, just enough honesty to admit that ignoring the question isn't working anymore. So he sells his flock, leaves behind everything familiar, and sails toward North Africa. If this were a simpler story, this would be the moment everything started working out. The hero takes a risk. Life rewards courage. The end, but that's not what happens. Within hours of arriving in Tangier, everything collapses. A stranger gains his trust, steals all his money, and disappears just like that. The dream that felt exciting yesterday suddenly feels expensive. A few days earlier, he was a shepherd with a future. Now he's standing alone in a city where he can't read the signs, can't speak the language, can't find his way home. The treasure feels impossibly far away, and for the first time, going back becomes a real option. That's the part people rarely talk about, because every meaningful journey eventually reaches this moment. The moment where escape is still possible. The moment where you can return to what you were before. The moment where nobody would blame you for quitting. The shepherd could go home, buy sheep again, tell himself it was all a mistake. Nobody would know, nobody except him, and that's what makes the choice painful. Not public failure, private surrender. Think about your own life. Maybe it wasn't a journey across a desert. Maybe it was a company, a book, a creative project, a career change, a risk you believed in. At first the dream feels exciting, then reality sends the invoice, the launch fails. The opportunity disappears, the rejection arrives, the timing falls apart, and suddenly the question changes. It is no longer, do I want this? Now it's, do I want it enough to continue when it stops rewarding me? Because it's easy to chase a dream when it costs nothing. The real test begins when it asks for something back. Standing in Tangier, the shepherd doesn't know it yet, but he's about to meet a man who has already answered that question. A man who once had a dream of his own, a man who spent years postponing it, then decades, a man who built an entire life around waiting, and in many ways, that man is more important to understanding this book than the treasure itself. Because the next character isn't going to show us what happens when someone follows their calling. He's going to show us what happens when they don't. The shepherd decides to work in a crystal shop. At first, it's just survival, a temporary stop. A way to earn enough money to continue toward Egypt, nothing more. But sometimes the most important people in our lives arrive disguised as detours. And standing behind the counter of that small shop, the shepherd meets a man he will never forget. Not because the man changes his life, because the man shows him a possible future. Every morning, the merchant unlocks the same door, the same hinges creak, the same shelves wait to be dusted, the same sunlight slides across the crystal. Outside, the same hill, the same street, the same city. Day after day, year after year, for nearly 30 years, the routine has become so familiar, it feels permanent, not happy, not miserable, permanent, and somehow, that is more unsettling. Because there is no dramatic collapse here, no catastrophe, no public failure, no tragedy anyone would notice. Just a life that slowly stopped moving. The merchant isn't lazy. He works every day. He isn't foolish. He understands business. He isn't bitter. He can still laugh. That's what makes him frightening. He's normal. The kind of normal nobody warns you about. The kind that happens one reasonable decision at a time, one postponement at a time, 1 year at a time. Until the life you plan to build quietly becomes the life you settled into. And somewhere inside that life, there is a dream, a pilgrimage to Mecca. For years he has imagined it, crossing the desert, walking through the sacred city, standing among thousands of other travelers, completing a journey he has carried in his heart for most of his life. The dream is not forgotten. That's the important part. The dream survived. Every morning it is still there, waiting. The shepherd doesn't understand. If the dream matters so much, the merchant has spent years saving money, years preparing, years imagining. So why does he remain behind the same counter? The answer arrives slowly, and when it arrives, it changes the entire story. Because the merchant isn't afraid of failing, he's afraid of finishing. He's afraid that the reality of Mecca might never match the version he has spent decades imagining. He's afraid that once the dream becomes real, there will be nothing left to dream about. Think about how strange that is. Most people assume the greatest danger is never achieving the dream. The merchant reveals something darker. Sometimes people become attached to the dream itself. Not the pursuit, not the reality, the possibility. Because possibilities are perfect. Reality never is. As long as Mecca stays in the future, it cannot disappoint him. As long as Mecca remains a dream, it remains flawless. And suddenly this story stops being about a merchant. Remember the person we imagined back in the beginning? 10 years older, sitting alone. Looking back, wondering what happened, the merchant is that person, the future self nobody plans to become, the version created not by failure, but by postponement. And that's why he feels so familiar. Not because we've met him, because parts of him already exist inside us. Then something unexpected happens. The shepherd begins changing the shop. A new display outside, more customers, more business, new ideas, new possibilities. The merchant resists almost every change at first, then watches them succeed. Week after week, the shop grows. Money increases. Customers arrive. For the first time in years, the merchant sees evidence that life could be different, that he could be different. The possibilities he buried long ago begin resurfacing, and that is when the tragedy deepens. Because before the shepherd arrived, the merchant had an excuse. The dream felt impossible. The future felt fixed. The horizon felt closed. Now those excuses are gone. The business improves. Opportunities expand. The path to Mecca becomes more realistic than ever, and yet, nothing changes. One evening, the merchant admits something devastating. Not because it's dramatic, because it's honest. He tells the shepherd that he has forced him to see horizons he had forgotten, possibilities he had ignored, and now that he can see them, he feels worse because he knows what he could do, and he knows he won't do it. That might be the saddest realization in the entire book. Not I cannot, not I never had the chance, but I know I can, and I'm still not going to. Some dreams die because people stop believing in them. His survived, that was the problem. The dream remained alive enough to haunt him, but not alive enough to move him. Hope had become a substitute for action. The thought of Mecca kept him alive, but it also kept him standing still. Only now do we recognize the pattern, the baker, the merchant, the shepherd. 3 people standing at the same crossroads. One chose certainty, one chose postponement, one chose the unknown. And for the first time, the shepherd understands what is truly at stake. This journey is no longer about treasure. It's about becoming the kind of person who acts before life hardens around them. The merchant eventually gives the shepherd his blessing, but not because he agrees with him, because he knows they're different. One will continue, the other will remain. One will pursue the horizon, the other will keep imagining it. And as the shepherd prepares to leave, the real question of the story finally comes into focus. What if the greatest risk in life isn't failure? What if the greatest risk is becoming comfortable enough to stop moving? Because the next part of the journey is going to challenge something even more powerful than comfort: love. By the time the shepherd leaves the crystal shop, he has money again. More than money, actually. He has proof. Proof that he can rebuild. Proof that he can survive uncertainty. Proof that a bad beginning doesn't guarantee a bad ending. For the first time since leaving Spain, turning back feels reasonable. Not because he failed, because he succeeded. He has enough money to buy twice as many sheep as before. He could return home, become a successful shepherd, tell stories about Africa, live comfortably, and no one would call him a coward. The strange thing about meaningful decisions is that they rarely arrive disguised as disasters. More often, they arrive disguised as acceptable alternatives. The shepherd stands at a crossroads. One road leads back to the life he understands. The other disappears into the desert. And somewhere between those two choices, he makes a discovery. The destination is no longer pulling him forward. He is. The journey has already started changing him. A year earlier, he needed certainty. Now he needs truth. And those are not the same thing, so he joins a caravan heading deeper into the Sahara. Toward the pyramids, toward the unknown, toward whatever waits beyond the horizon. The desert is vast, silent, endless. Days blend together. The wind erases footprints almost as quickly as they appear. And somewhere in that sea of sand, the shepherd begins learning a different language. Not Spanish, not Arabic. Something harder to explain. The language of attention, the language of signs, the language of noticing. Because the people he meets keep repeating the same lesson in different forms. Life is always speaking. Most people are simply too distracted to listen. Then the caravan reaches an oasis, a place that shouldn't feel important, a temporary refuge, a pause in the journey. But sometimes the moments that change our lives arrive quietly, not with fanfare, not with certainty, not with warning, just a glance, a conversation, a person standing beside a well. And that is where he meets Fatima. The book moves quickly here, almost suspiciously quickly. One moment she's a stranger. The next, the shepherd knows, not because she completes him, not because she saves him, because for the first time, the future stops feeling abstract. Suddenly there is something to stay for, someone to stay for, and that changes everything. Until now, every obstacle has been external. Money, distance, language, fear. Fatima introduces a different challenge, a beautiful one. Because now the question becomes, what happens when your deepest desire collides with another deep desire? What happens when purpose meets love? Most people assume they already know the answer. Choose one, sacrifice the other. That's the story we're used to hearing. But this book isn't interested in that story. The shepherd begins imagining a different future, a peaceful future. Life in the oasis, a home, a family. The endless uncertainty finally coming to an end. For the first time, continuing the journey feels harder than staying. And honestly, who could blame him? If the crystal merchant represented the temptation of comfort, Fatima represents the temptation of completion. The feeling that maybe you've already found enough, maybe the search can stop here. Then something remarkable happens. Fatima refuses to become the reason he stays. She doesn't ask him to abandon the journey. She doesn't ask him to choose between love and purpose. She tells him to continue. Because she understands something the shepherd is still learning. Real love does not demand that someone become less themselves. Real love doesn't shrink a person's world. It expands it. And then the book delivers one of its most important ideas, an idea that quietly dismantles one of the most common excuses people use. The alchemist later tells Santiago that if something is truly part of your destiny, it will not stand in the way of your personal legend. If you abandon your path because of love, then it was not the kind of love you believed it was. That's a difficult idea, especially because so many people spend their lives blaming circumstances, the relationship, the job, the timing, the responsibility, the location. But the book keeps pointing in the same direction, back toward choice. Then the alchemist paints a picture of an alternate future, a future where Santiago stays. At first, everything seems perfect. He marries Fatima, becomes respected, builds a life, and for a while he is happy. But then something begins to happen. The treasure returns, the omens return. The unanswered question returns. Year after year, the feeling grows. Until eventually, life that once felt like a blessing begins to feel like a reminder of what he did not pursue. And suddenly we realize something. The crystal merchant wasn't merely a warning. He was a preview, the future awaiting anyone who repeatedly chooses comfort over calling. The future Santiago is now being offered. The same trap, just in a more beautiful form. This is the real test. Not whether Santiago can survive the desert, not whether he can find treasure, not whether he can read omens. The real test is whether he trusts that pursuing his path will not destroy what matters most. Whether he trusts that love strong enough to matter is also strong enough to wait, so he makes his choice. Not against Fatima, not against love, but in honor of both, he continues deeper into the desert, closer to the pyramids, closer to the answer he has been chasing since the beginning. And waiting beyond the dunes is a man who will teach him the final lesson, a lesson that changes the meaning of treasure itself. The deeper Santiago travels into the desert, the less the journey feels physical. The pyramids are still ahead, the treasure is still ahead, but something else is happening now. The questions are changing. Earlier in the story, Santiago wanted answers. Now he wants understanding. Earlier he was trying to find treasure. Now he is trying to understand the language behind everything he has experienced. The sheep, the dream, the merchant, the desert, Fatima, the omens. Somehow, they all feel connected, as if they have been pointing toward the same lesson from the very beginning. And that is when he meets the alchemist, not in a laboratory, not surrounded by gold, not performing miracles. Just a man in the desert, calm, observant, dangerously simple. The kind of person who seems to understand something everyone else is missing. The Englishman had spent years searching for this man through books. Santiago finds him through experience. And that difference matters, because the alchemist doesn't give Santiago new information. He helps him trust what he already knows. At first, this feels disappointing. The alchemist offers no grand secret, no hidden formula, no shortcut, no map to the treasure. Again and again, he points Santiago back toward the same thing. Your heart, listen to it, trust it, follow it. Not because it is always comfortable, but because it already knows the path. That sounds simple. Until you try it. Because hearts are strange things. They remember fear, they remember loss, they remember disappointment. Sometimes they tell us to move forward, sometimes they beg us to stay safe. And the closer Santiago gets to the pyramids, the louder those fears become. Because every meaningful journey becomes more frightening near the end. At the beginning, failure is theoretical. Near the end, it becomes real. The closer you get to discovering the truth, the more you risk discovering you were wrong. Then the desert delivers its final test. Santiago and the alchemist are captured by warriors. Suspicion fills the air, weapons surround them, and in order to save their lives, the alchemist makes an impossible claim. He tells the warriors that Santiago can transform himself into the wind. There is only one problem. Santiago has absolutely no idea how to do that. Imagine the terror, not metaphorical fear. Real fear. The kind that tightens your chest. The kind that makes your thoughts race. The kind that arrives when excuses finally run out. Because this is no longer about treasure. No longer about purpose. No longer about dreams. Now it is life or death. Santiago searches for an answer and finds none. No strategy, no technique, no solution, only silence. Then something remarkable happens. Instead of forcing an answer, he begins listening. To the desert, to the wind, to the sun. Not because the novel is suddenly interested in magic. Because the novel is interested in connection. Again and again, Santiago discovers that everything around him is participating in the same search. The desert is searching. The wind is searching. The sun is searching, each trying to fulfill its own purpose, each trying to become what it was meant to become. And suddenly the story circles back to where it began. The baker, the merchant, Fatima, the shepherd. Every character has been facing the same question. Will you become what you are capable of becoming, or will fear decide for you? That has always been the question. The desert asks it. The wind asks it. Life asks it. Then comes the realization, the one everything has been building toward. Santiago understands that love is not possession. Love is not safety. Love is not control. Love is the force that allows something to become more fully itself. The desert becomes the desert. The wind becomes the wind. The sun becomes the sun. And a person becomes who they are meant to become. In that moment, the boundaries separating him from the world begin to disappear. And then, the wind arrives, first as a breeze, then stronger still. Sand rises into the air, tents shake, voices disappear beneath the roar. The entire camp watches in disbelief. The storm grows so powerful that people can barely see. When it finally ends, Santiago is standing somewhere else entirely, alive, changed. And for the first time, he truly understands what the alchemist has been trying to teach him. The miracle was never becoming the wind. The miracle was becoming the kind of person capable of it. Because all throughout the story, Santiago kept waiting for proof. Proof that the dream mattered. Proof that the journey was worth it. Proof that the treasure existed. But every step of the journey was secretly teaching a different lesson. The shepherd taught freedom. The merchant taught regret. Fatima taught trust. The desert taught patience. The alchemist taught belief. And together, those lessons transformed the boy who began this journey into someone entirely different. The irony is almost impossible to miss. The closer Santiago gets to the treasure, the less the treasure seems to matter. Because the real transformation has already happened. The boy who left Spain could never have become the wind, could never have understood the desert, could never have survived the journey. That version of Santiago had to disappear. So another version could emerge. Soon, the alchemist leaves him. The teacher steps aside. The final stretch must be walked alone, and standing at the edge of the desert, with the pyramids finally within reach. Santiago believes the hardest part of the journey is over. It is not. The greatest surprise of the entire story is still waiting for him. And it is about to change the meaning of treasure itself at last. Santiago arrives. The pyramids rise from the desert exactly as they appeared in his dreams. Massive, ancient, almost unreal. For years they have existed in his imagination. Now they stand in front of him, the thing he crossed a continent to find, the thing he sacrificed for, the thing he nearly abandoned, the thing that survived every setback, every fear, every temptation, every reason to turn back. And standing before them, Santiago does what many people would do after a long journey. He cries. Not because he found the treasure, because he finally arrived. Then he begins to dig and dig and dig, hour after hour, certain that the journey is finally coming to an end. Certain that everything is about to make sense, certain that the reward is waiting just beneath the sand. But nothing appears, no gold, no chest, no treasure, nothing. And then, the story delivers one final blow. A group of thieves appears, they beat him, rob him, and demand to know why he is digging in the middle of nowhere. For a moment, it feels almost cruel. After everything, after Spain, after Tangier, after the merchant, after Fatima, after the desert, after becoming the wind, this is what he gets. Desperate, Santiago tells them the truth. He tells them about the recurring dream, the treasure, the pyramids, the entire journey. And one of the thieves starts laughing, not because he thinks Santiago is foolish, because he once had a dream too, a ridiculous dream. A dream about treasure hidden beneath a sycamore tree growing inside the ruins of an abandoned church in Spain. The same church where Santiago slept with his sheep. The same church where the journey began. The same church where he first had the dream. The treasure was there all along. And suddenly, Everything changes, not because Santiago finally knows where the treasure is, because we do, the audience does, and in that moment, the story asks a question far more important than, where was the treasure? The real question is, why did he have to travel thousands of miles to discover something that was waiting for him at home? Why the desert? Why the merchant? Why Fatima? Why the alchemist? Why any of it? Imagine the story ending differently. Imagine the old king meeting Santiago in the town square and saying, "Don't go anywhere, the treasure is under the tree back home." The story would end in 5 minutes. Santiago would find the gold and lose everything that mattered. Because the treasure was never what the journey was producing. The journey was producing Santiago. The boy who slept beneath that church could not have recognized the treasure. Not really. He had never lost everything. Never rebuilt. Never loved. Never let go. Never faced fear. Never stood before death. Never learned to trust himself. Never learned to listen. Never learned who he was. The gold was buried beneath the tree, but the person capable of finding it wasn't. That person had to be created. And suddenly, every character in the story reveals their purpose. The baker showed us what happens when possibility becomes respectability. The crystal merchant showed us what happens when hope replaces action. Fatima showed us what love looks like when it supports purpose instead of replacing it. The alchemist showed us that wisdom is not something you collect, it's something you become. Even the thieves had a role, because without them, Santiago never learns where the treasure actually is. Every person, every setback, every detour, every loss was part of the same conversation. The conversation life was trying to have with him from the beginning. So Santiago returns. Back across the desert, back across the sea, back to the abandoned church, back to the place he thought he had outgrown. Only now he sees it differently, because he is different. The tree is the same, the church is the same, the earth beneath his feet is the same. But the person standing there is not, and that changes everything. He digs. The shovel strikes something solid. A chest, gold coins, jewels, artifacts, enough wealth to change his life forever. The treasure is real, the dream was real, the journey was real, but something remarkable happens at this moment. The treasure no longer feels like the point, because after everything that came before, the gold feels almost secondary. Even Santiago seems to understand this. His thoughts don't linger on wealth. They drift toward Fatima, toward the people he met, toward the lessons he learned, toward the life waiting for him. And that's when the book quietly reveals its deepest idea. The crystal merchant spent his life protecting a dream. Santiago spent his life pursuing one. Both men wanted certainty. Only one was willing to move without it. Both men were afraid. Only one continued anyway. Both men heard the call. Only one answered. The difference was never talent, never intelligence, never luck. It was action. Remember the person we imagined at the beginning? 10 years older, sitting alone, looking back, wondering what happened. That person still exists for all of us. The question has never been whether we have a dream. Most people do. The question is whether we are willing to let that dream change us. Whether we are willing to become someone new in pursuit of it. Because that's the secret hidden beneath the treasure. Not every dream leads to gold. Not every journey ends the way we hope. But every meaningful pursuit asks the same thing in return. Growth, transformation, motion. The crystal merchant wasn't tragic because he failed. He was tragic because every morning he woke up knowing exactly what he wanted. And every night he found another reason to wait. Santiago found treasure. But that isn't why this story survived for decades. It survived because somewhere inside the journey, every reader recognizes themselves. In the baker, in the merchant, in Fatima, in Santiago. And eventually, they realize something uncomfortable. They have a crystal shop. A place in their life where waiting has started to feel normal. A place where someday has quietly become a habit. So maybe the real question isn't, what is my treasure? Maybe the real question is, what part of my life have I convinced myself I'll get to someday? And if I continue waiting, what will it cost me? Because the treasure at the end of Santiago's journey wasn't hidden beneath the pyramids. It was hidden inside the person he became while searching for it. And that journey is still available to anyone willing to begin.